This is the podcast of Gang of Witches. This month, the second carte blanche to What the Feminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. Le sabbat, c'est par là. Gang of Witches.
For this special Samhain episode, we welcome the great witch and eco-feminist activist Starhawk.
Hello, Starhawk. Thank you for accepting to talk in the Gang of Witches podcast. You're an author, you're an activist, you're a permaculturalist teacher, but you're also a pagan witch and a shaman. So your first name was Miriam Simos, now you're Starhawk. How did you become Starhawk?
Well, I got interested in witches and witchcraft when I was actually quite young, when I was in my first year in college. Actually, before that, even when I was around 15, one of my dearest friends, who at that time was Becky, but later became Isis, she and I had a booth at the Renaissance Fair reading tarot cards together and met some witches in the Witches' Wood. The fair was like a big fair where people would dress up in Renaissance costumes and they would do like reenactments and, have things that kind of brought you back to those early medieval times. And it was done as a big fundraiser for our local radio station that was progressive and had progressive news on it. So it was always a lot of fun to participate in that. And I don't know why we thought we could have a booth reading tarot cards, because we'd really only learned how to read them a few weeks before, but that didn't stop us. And then later, when I was in my first year in college, I was doing an anthropology project with another friend, and we decided to do it on witches, and we met some of those original witches from the Witches' Wood who had a booth selling potions and candles and things like that. And they started telling us that witchcraft was actually the old pre-Christian indigenous religion of Europe and the Middle East, and the parts of it that had survived, the healing traditions, the folk customs, and all of that had been suppressed under Christianity, but they had never really died out. Kind of like today, if you go to Mexico or Latin America, you'll see people are doing things at the church or in the name of the church, but what they're actually doing are the old indigenous rituals. They've just changed the outer forms a little bit. And that was the way life was in Europe throughout, much of medieval and early Renaissance times, up until the times of the witch burnings. And even today, you can still find places where those old healing traditions survive. So I found that just fascinating and got very interested, and we were researching and reading and learning and decided to form a coven, although we had no clear idea what that meant, and started practicing, and then eventually started training with some of those older, more experienced witches. A few years later, the feminist movement really exploded in the U.S., and I got very involved with that. And it seemed to me that there should be a connection between feminism and an old religion that saw the creator, the great spirit, whatever, as a goddess, as female, and that had women as leaders, and that saw sexuality and the body and nature as sacred. And at first, I thought I was the only person crazy enough to think that, because most of the feminist movement was very ultra rational and Marxist, and religion was the opiate of the people, and all this was just woo woo. But I met other people, like there was a witch named Z Budapest who had learned her tradition. Her family came from Hungary. She came from Hungary, actually. Um, and they had an old family tradition, and she started a group called the Feminist Wicca in Los Angeles, where I was living. And there were other people who also had the same idea. So throughout the late 70s and early 80s, we were doing a lot of experimenting, a lot of research. It was not until the late 70s that there started to be a lot of writing and information available. Merlin Stone's book, When God Was a Woman, came out, I think, in 1976. And I met her at a conference, which was one of the first I had been to around the whole idea of a feminist approach to spirituality. Um, and I had started writing about this spiritual exploration. And finally, my book, The Spiral Dance, was published in 1979. Another wonderful woman witch, Margot Adler, who's also a journalist who worked for many years for National Public Radio. She published a book at the same year, Drawing Down the Moon. And I think that was when the idea of a feminist approach to Wicca and spirituality really began to grow. And throughout the 80s, Maria Gimbutas, who's the archaeologist who did so much work on the early goddesses of old Europe, her books were published. Um, a lot more writing, a lot more research, a lot more scholarship all began happening around that time. And of course, in those days, that was before the internet. So this wasn't going on, you couldn't just Google feminist Wicca. It was much more challenging to find out this information, but there were books that were published. There was a network of women's bookstores where people would hold often readings or discussion groups. There were classes and workshops that people would offer. There were magazines. People would Xerox articles and mail them to each other. And information spread and knowledge spread. And it was a very exciting time.
Could you talk to us a bit more about covens?
Covens have web pages, and groups have information and public gatherings. The group I work with is called Reclaiming. We began in the late 70s and started teaching classes in the early 80s. We were also very much involved in doing a lot of nonviolent direct action around nuclear issues and nuclear war in the early 80s. That was when Ronald Reagan was elected and was talking about nuclear war being winnable. So our tradition was highly influenced by a way of horizontal organizing that was anti-authoritarian, where people meet in small groups and make decisions by consensus. And that was always the model for our circles and covens. And we have groups now all over the US and in Canada, in Europe. We have witches in France and in Australia and Brazil and many different places around the world. I think more people have begun to come around to it, kind of coming to it maybe through the doorway of ecofeminism and understanding that, to make the changes we need to make in terms of our relationship with the natural world, that is a change in our deep values. It's a change in our underlying worldview, how we perceive and experience the world. And to me, those are the things we mean when we say spiritual. We don't necessarily mean believing in something that you can't demonstrate or see. We mean shifting our attitude towards the things we can see. You don't have to believe in a tree spirit, but you can look at a tree and see that the tree drops its leaves and the leaves go back to the earth, and microorganisms in the earth take them apart, transform them into compost, into nutrients that feed the roots of the tree, and the tree grows. And this is a cycle of birth and growth and death and regeneration. And that cycle is something that fills us with a sense of awe and reverence and beauty. And it connects to all the other cycles that are going on all around us and within us. And that, to me, is what we mean when we say goddess, not a big lady in skirts, but this understanding of the way that nature works in these circles and the deep interconnectedness of all of life.
Sabrine Kasbaoui's Rebellion's Notebook.
Rebellion's Notebook is the creation diary of my documentary web series Covens. A coven is a clan, a gathering. In the film, I document all types of circles that are living or moving towards an ecological, economic, and social transition. I gather the assemblies which rise up, which resist. In doing so, I try to support and build my own transition, my own change of life. Outside at night, between dogs and wolves, in the middle of a wild garden in the middle of Corrèze, I pick up the melodic voices of a circle of women in which I have just participated. Caroline is the initiator. She is a doula, which means that she accompanies pregnant women and those around them. She supports the work of midwives. She also advocates fertile disobedience. The term is loaded with poetry. It creates. Where civil disobedience denounces an injustice perpetrated by an institution to change it, fertile disobedience wants to allow the experimentation and the creation of new societies respectful of the living, without worrying about the existing laws, nor that its inhabitants are worried by policemen. Caroline lives independently in nature with her companion and her 2 young children. Between fields and forests, they built with their hands the 40-metre squared hut in which they live. Made from natural materials recycled and found on site, such as earth and straw, they adapt day after day to a lifestyle that requires them to follow the cycles of the ecosystem in which they have chosen to settle. They cultivate their garden, drink the water from the spring which flows below, and wash themselves in the river which borders the fields near where their nest is installed. Inside day, early in the morning, I find Caroline and her family having breakfast. Their daily life is not marginal. The herbal tea boils on the gas stove. The little ones babble patiently. The bunk beds are still undone. The dewy light gently penetrates the hut. Caroline has not always lived this way. She has left everything behind, a luxurious life to adopt a more resilient lifestyle, which in fact decreases. For 2 years, with her companion Jonathan, they have been defending a light habitat that allows them to live as closely as possible to nature. Faced with the climate emergency, as Jonathan says, they are thus trying to get out of the Anthropocene. Activists, they regularly welcome the public to the site where they live in order to share their convictions, and are very present on social networks in order to relay the initiative. Outside during the day, Caroline drew a circle in which a dozen women were able to give themselves up in confidence and remake a world which is too often violent. She invited this small assembly, who did not know each other when they arrived, to discuss the place that guilt takes in their lives. Around an altar of flowers, cookies, and dried fruits, women deliver both intimately, but also draw up a more global inventory of social injustice, which creates other forms of guilt. Each woman has her say. The talking stick made by Caroline's little girl goes around easily. Those timid at the start manage to open up easily. The circle initiated by Caroline forges links, creates connections between people, each one more different than the other. The anthropology student, singer, kinesiologist, social worker. It unites by going to seek in them what brings them together, the interior place of their community. Caroline heals, both individually but also collectively. The circle breaks down the dividing lines of a society that divides and isolates. From this point of view, not far from her role of doula, Caroline becomes a healer once again. Outside at night between dog and wolf, end of sequence. A spontaneous song. Despite her own shyness, she throws a note. Everything else then flows naturally. The hands are tied to each other, the breaths granted. The voices rise in a harmonious sound that the night does not stifle but releases. Maybe you could say more about how you feel about this connection.
Yeah, for me, the connection with the earth it's something that is part of every aspect of life. It's around us all the time. It influences everything I do from the time I wake up in the morning till the time I go to bed. Um, I like to start the day by just going outside and watching and looking and listening and taking some time to be still in the natural world and listening to what's happening, noticing the changes around me. I spend a lot of time. I spend a lot of time online, like everybody these days. But I also try to spend a lot of time walking in nature, for an hour or so at least every day. That's partly for my own physical health, but also just to stay connected to the changes and to see, in some ways, this year of COVID-19 has been a blessing because I haven't been able to travel, which I usually do a lot. So to be in one place and actually get to watch the progression of the wildflowers and the changes in the bird song and the things that are going on around is a real teaching and a real lesson. And it's those larger cycles that we connect with and understand that gives us the understanding of how to really work with the land where we are and how to bring it back to life and health. I do a lot of gardening and a lot of land tending. I'm lucky enough to have land out in the west coast of California. So we've got forest lands and grasslands. Um, it's pretty steep and rugged, and it has many challenges, especially water, because we have very limited amount of water in the summer, and fire, because with climate change, wildfires have been increasing and becoming more and more dangerous and more prevalent. Right now, um, even today, the sky is a kind of pale melon color, this from smoke from the fires that are raging all over the West. And yesterday, it was really scary. It was like the apocalypse. I woke up in the morning and it was as dark as it is pre-dawn. I kept hoping I was wrong about the time, but I wasn't, and it got darker throughout the day. It was like um, the sky was like a blood red, orange color all day long. The solar panels weren't charging. And it was from, there's right now, I think, something like 100 fires burning in California, there's fires all over Oregon and Washington. It's all up and down the West Coast. There's no escape from it. We are in the throes of climate change, and we desperately need to come back into balance with the natural world. When you're in the thick of it like this, it's very hard to deny that this is happening. Fire is always part of the landscape in California. We're a fire ecology. Our landscape is meant to burn periodically. The indigenous peoples managed it elegantly for tens of thousands of years with careful prescribed burning that they did in a sacred way, to keep the fuel loads down, to create a mosaic of burned and unburned lands so that land could regenerate. And if a fire did come from lightning or from some other cause, it didn't have these masses of um, brush and fuel and stuff to build on into these firestorms. It stayed lower and cooler and less destructive. And that created incredible habitat for wildlife. It helped the health of the plants and the forests, helped keep down disease. But we've had 150 years now of fire suppression, especially the last 100 years, of our Forest Service putting out fires, people not doing that kind of burning. And that added to the intensive fuel loads, climate change increasing the heat. Last week we had some of the hottest days ever on record in California. The loss of things like the elk that used to graze our forests and again help keep them open, keep the underbrush down, that creates these tremendously dangerous conditions. So a lot of what I've been doing over this last year has been teaching people about fire resilience, doing what I can on my own land to protect it, um, trying to figure out the ways that we as communities can come back into balance. And there are things that we can do. There are ways that we can treat the land to create more resilience when fire does come, to create more of a likelihood that your home will survive if fire burns around it, to reduce the intensity of the fires when they do get started. But we need the political will in this country to do those things. And that's the other front we have to fight on, you could say. It's not so much what we do in the woods, it's the consciousness that we have as people to make the decisions about what we do in the woods.
You wrote in your book that is called The Fifth Sacred Thing. It was a fiction that will happen in 2048, and the United States were going to be disunited, and where there also is a massive ecological crisis. So would you say like this is happening right now in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, we are facing a really crucial election right now in 2020 that I think will determine what road we go on. Um, if we elect Biden and Kamala Harris, we have a real potential, I think, for bringing us back into balance, for dealing with climate change, for dealing with many other things, and kind of coming back into, say, a sane world where we can address these problems. And I just really want to be clear that we can address these problems. We have the options, the things we need to do about climate change. That's not impossible to solve this problem. In fact, the things that we need to do to address climate change are actually nice things. We just need to get off nasty, dirty, polluting fossil fuels that create incredible amounts of problems and pollutions even beyond climate change. Um, and shift to clean renewables. And we have the technology to do that. And we could do that without even having to give up, huge aspects of our current lifestyle if we put our political will to doing it. We might do well to give up certain aspects of our lifestyle here in the United States, but but it's completely feasible to do that. What stands in the way are the people who have vested interests in holding on to the current system and the power and the profits that they make in it. And so we need to marshal the political will to oppose them and take that power away from them because we need that. We need that, especially because our system is skewed in ways that favor the Republicans, even though they don't have a majority, and because there's a real fear that Trump might not leave office, even if he loses. So we need to be prepared for, how to actually defend our democracy if we need to do that by voting and also by finding ways to organize and be prepared to take action and refuse cooperation with a regime that tries to institute itself illegally. That's the path I hope we'll go down because the other path, even though it fits with what I wrote in the Fifth Sacred Thing, just because I wrote it doesn't mean I want it to happen, right? Yeah. But it's very clear now how easy it would be for the United States to break apart with if Trump contests the election or tries to steal the election in different states. On the West Coast, we tend to be more united as a group of states, partly because we share an ecology and a fire ecology and more progressive electorate. And part of that, I think, is because when you live in a place like this and you're dealing with wildfires and you're waking up in the morning and the sun's not rising from the smoke, and this is happening all up and down the West Coast, it's a lot harder to persuade the mass of people that this is some Chinese hoax that's not really happening. We know it's happening. And one of the lessons of fire is also that um, you have to deal with it as a community. You are interdependent. You're completely dependent on choices your neighbors make. If one of your neighbors or somebody 100 miles away from you flicks a cigarette into the dry brush, you may be breathing the smoke the next day. Your home may go from some oblivious person who sets off fireworks on the hottest day of the year, which is what happened in Southern California. And you're utterly dependent on your friends, your neighbors, your community for safety, for fire protection. A lot of our firefighters are volunteer firefighters who are just people in the community who give a lot of their time and energy to training and preparing and being on call and responding to fires. And they also respond to medical emergencies. So it builds in a real practical understanding of interdependence. That we have this American myth that, we're all in it alone and I am the master of my fate. And you can't believe that when you are faced with a wildfire. No one can fight a wildfire alone. It takes a community to do that.
The author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, wrote and said that we should all be feminists. Do you think we should all be witches?
I don't know if we should all be witches because witches don't proselytize. We don't try to go around and convert the world to seeing it the same way we do. And because there are so many incredible indigenous traditions that would not call themselves or consider themselves witches. But what I would say is that we all need to come back into relationship with the natural world. And I think there are pathways to do that in the major religions and in indigenous cultures and folk cultures, and through just pure rational science, learning about evolution and learning about natural history. All those things are pathways to having a real relationship with nature. Understanding nature is not just something you watch on the Discovery Channel, videos on YouTube, right? It is something you live in and experience, and that we need to have a relationship with it that is quite real to the place where we are, to the cycles, to the seasons, to the earth, to the land. Um, those are the things that actually sustain our lives and that we need to understand and know and come to terms with, if we want to actually have a full life as a human being, and if we want to make the decisions that we need to make that will allow us to create a society that is more in balance with the natural world.
A full moon, a vegetable.
Veggies to the rescue. The revolution is on the menu.
Radish or not, here I come, you can't hide. Gonna find you and harvest you, see. Radish or not, here I come, you can't hide. Gonna clean you and eat you slowly.
Yo, I eat my radishes full of properties, then I rest, no stress, alkalize, energize. I must confess, their varieties manifest. They can be black or white, if they're red, it's for starters. Food orgies with veggies are best. If you can grow them, it's even better, yes. Bless you if you eat mostly plant-based, but they trick you with bad chemicals if you don't care. Beware, pick your food consciously. Easy, believe me, food industry give me heebie-jeebies. So while you think about them criminals, give me your dish, I'ma unleash the radish.
Radish or not, here I come, you can't hide. Gonna find you and harvest you, see. Radish or not, here I come, you can't hide. Gonna clean you and eat you slowly. You can't run away from my recipes of veggie, yeah, veggie. Cause I got a lot, oh yeah. And everywhere you go, my whole crew's gonna know veggie, hey veggie. You can't hide from the fork, oh no.
What would represent the moon for you?
To me, the moon has so many different symbolic meanings. It represents the beauty of the night and the embracing of the dark, understanding that this metaphor we have in Western culture of light being good and dark being bad is kind of underlies racism and underlies the way that we view people who are darker or lighter. And to me, part of witchiness, you can't have day without night. You can't have light without darkness. And the moon represents that. To me, it represents that night is powerful and magical and beautiful. And that also within the darkness, there's always a seed of light, like the moonlight and the starlight. And within the light and the day, there's also always a seed of darkness, the shade and the shadow. That things are intertwined and interwoven, and things are never wholly one thing or another. The moon also represents those cycles of birth and growth and death and regeneration in the way that she's dark and then grows and becomes lighter, becomes the full moon, and then transforms and becomes the waning moon and the dark moon again. So those cycles, which are also linked to women's cycles and menstrual cycles and other cycles in nature, again, represents that whole process, represents to me that death and regeneration are always linked with one another. And the moon represents magic. The full moon is that time where there's just an energy that floods the world, and that's quite beautiful and magical, and that awakens deep intuition and deep parts of ourselves.
The rites of passage and all the transmission, your transmission rituals you're making with the young girls.
Yeah, we felt for a long time that for young girls, for those who are born with a female body, coming to terms with all the things that body does is really hard in a culture that kind of despises femaleness and woman, and thinks about female processes like menstruation as something dirty and shameful and nasty. So we began back in the 80s doing rituals for young girls when they first begin to menstruate, to honor that and to help them celebrate that change and that passage of coming into adulthood. And we looked at some of the other traditions and things that um, many indigenous cultures would do to celebrate their girls coming of age. And we created something that seemed to fit for our current situation. So what we would do is we'd go down to the beach or go up on a hillside and take the girl and her mother and tie their hands together with red ribbons. And they would run together, and they would run as far as they could run and as far as the mother could run. And then we cut them apart and let the daughter run on alone, to symbolize her drawing strength from her mother, but also now moving into a stage of life where she would maybe go further than her mother was able to go. And then we'd go and we'd have an afternoon where we would celebrate her and give her gifts and give her special magical tools and offerings and tell her the stories of our own first menstruation. And for many women of my age and my era, that was not a beautiful thing. It was a shameful thing. It was something you were embarrassed about, or something that your parents were embarrassed about. I remember my mother telling me that, the old Jewish tradition, which is my heritage, was to slap a girl in the face, and they would say it was to give you rosy cheeks, but really it's kind of like something much deeper than that. It's like an assault when you reach that crucial time. And so telling those stories kind of made them become part of the whole chain of women's history. And then we would have a feast that the men would cook of red foods and a celebration with the whole community. And to us, that was very important to understand that men could also celebrate this in women. And it wasn't something you had to hide or be ashamed of. And the awareness that just because you're born with a certain body doesn't mean you identify with that gender. If we want to live in a culture that celebrates all those different varieties and flavors of gender, we have to basically be able to honor what actually is going on in people's bodies. And we've got to do that in a culture that honors and that values the body, whatever it is, whatever its shape, whatever its form. If we can come into a culture like that, then I think we can actually truly value all the different flavors and varieties of genders and identities. But if we try to do that on the basis of a culture that hates and despises femaleness, then we're in trouble and we aren't going to really be able to embrace the multiplicity of possibilities in all of their beauty.
Flash cool.
Francis Allais, an 82 years old French botanist, announced at the end of September 2020 that his ambitious project of a 70,000 hectare old-growth forest will come true. Indeed, his initiative is set to receive legal aid from the European Commission. Francis Allais would like to see his preserved from human hand space to include at least 3 countries. Let's recall that Europe does not have an old-growth forest anymore, except for the Białowieża forest in Poland. In France, the last old-growth forest disappeared in the 19th century. Besides storing CO2, Allais's European old-growth forest will allow species to be reborn on our continent. US presidential elections, a record 298 women in total are running for the House of Representatives on a major party ticket, according to the Center for American Women in Politics. 117 women of color are running for Congress as Democrats or Republicans. 71% of them are running as Democrats, the other 29% as Republicans. The number of women candidates exceeds that of 2018 midterm elections. The 2020 elections could see more women of color come to power, for example in Missouri through Cori Bush or Kendachi Valenzuela in Texas.
For the first time ever, Europeans have produced more renewable energies than fossil energies. According to analysis by Amber, an independent climate think tank, renewable energies have created 40% of the electricity in the 27 countries of the European Union for the first semester, whereas fossil energies accounted for 34%. This comes from the rise of solar and wind-powered energies and the fall of demand for fossil energies. CO2 emissions have therefore decreased from 23% in the electricity sector.
Just a question about what you said about the election and the necessity to push people to go to vote.
Yeah. Well, here in the US, there are many different organizations. It's challenging this year because normally what people would do would be go door to door and knock on doors and talk to people. Now with COVID, we can't really do that here because we've done such a terrible job of dealing with it that people are still locked down and not able to go out in the same way and afraid to talk to strangers at their doorstep. But we have the capacity to make calls, to write letters. There's a lot of different places where you can sign up and they'll train you of how to call people, and you can call people all over the country and talk to them and give them information about how they can apply for a vote by mail ballot, how to fill it out correctly, um, answer their questions about the candidates. So thousands and thousands of people are doing that. And a lot of people have signed up to become poll workers because one of the problems has been most people who work at the polls have been older, retired people who are most at risk for COVID. So now there's been a big push for younger people, and thousands of people have signed up for that. People can talk to their own friends and their neighbors. I've been doing a magical activism class online. And I'm also going to be doing a free webinar with a friend of mine who's a chef who is going to be offering a cooking class for our Earth Activist Training Program online. And we're going to do a politics and apple pie webinar. We'll teach you how to make an apple pie, which is, we have this saying, American is apple pie, right? And then encouraging people to do what we have done for every election the last few years, which is, generally been gathering a party in person, but this time it would be probably more on Zoom, sharing some dessert and talking about, all the candidates and all the propositions. Here in California, people can put a proposition on the ballot, and often there's like dozens of them, and it can be very confusing to go through them. So we'll sort of assign different people to research, what all the propositions are and which we want to vote for and which we don't, who all the minor candidates are that nobody's heard of for things like the water board or the judges that, you don't get a lot of publicity around them, but they're actually very important in making many of the decisions that affect people's lives. So, getting a group of together and everyone does the research, and then we all come together and share that information and help people fill out their ballots. And it's a beautiful way to encourage people again to vote or to volunteer. I've always in my life been more the street action, get out and protest person, and that's also really important. But right now, here in the US, like voting is just, whatever your issue is, the most important thing we can do right now is to get the abuser in chief out of the White House and elect Biden and Harris, create conditions where we can make the changes that we need to make to bring us back into balance.
Inhale, exhale. It's time to meditate.
This is what I do as a personal practice every day. We call it grounding. It's a way of energetically connecting to the earth. And I like to do it outside every morning. And then just spend some time listening and looking and noticing what's happening around me. But to do it, just find a place where you can sit and be comfortable, or stand if you prefer that. And take some deep breaths down into your belly. And really feel your diaphragm work. So that breathing is a whole body activity. You're filling your lungs very deeply and pushing that breath out very completely. And you might imagine yourself like a tree with roots that go down into the earth, down through your legs and feet, and down through the base of your spine. And imagine them pushing down into the soil and the land around you, feeling the qualities of that soil, feeling the waters that are held in the soil and under the earth, and down through layers of rock and gravel, all the way down to that core of fire in the heart of the earth where the rock is still molten, and hot and liquid from the earth's formation. And you can take a breath, and there's something you want to release and let go of, something that's worrying you or bothering you. You can take a deep breath and just let that go down through those roots, down into the earth. Let that fire take it and transform it back into pure energy. And now taking a breath, draw a spark of that fire up through your roots, up into your feet and legs, up into the base of your spine, your belly. Feel your spine start to grow and stretch like a beautiful tree trunk growing up with that energy. Take a moment, feel it in your heart, and let your heart open and expand. Breathe it up through your shoulders and down through your arms and hands. And maybe reach up and out and imagine it coming out the top of your head like branches and reach up to the sky. And feeling like a very old tree, let those branches grow all the way down so they touch the earth again. They make a cycle, they make a circuit. And then through those leaves and branches, you can feel sunlight or moonlight, starlight. Take a deep breath and just draw some of that light, that sky energy down through the top of your head, down through your leaves and branches, down to your heart, your hands, and your belly, all the way down through your legs and feet into the earth. And just take a moment, feel that energy running through you. Feel how your energy is connected to the earth energy. You have energy stored in the earth you can draw on if you need it. But you don't have to carry it around. You don't have to be like filled up with anxiety or nervousness. You can be calm, you can be relaxed, but you can have energy available to you. And feel that sky energy coming down and mingling with the earth energy. And feel yourself as a bridge between earth and sky. And now that we're grounded, now that we've got our energy connected to the earth energy, let's take a moment and bring ourselves into our physical senses. So notice how your body feels with gravity, maybe where it's touching a chair or touching the ground, how the weight of your body is falling, maybe where there's tension or relaxation. Feel the air on your skin, whether it's warm or cool, whether it feels different where you've got clothing. Take a deep sniff in and notice what you smell. What does that tell you about the world? Imagine you had the nose of a dog or a wolf. You could smell 30,000 times as much as we smell. And notice what you taste. Do you still have a little coffee on the back of your tongue? Open your ears and notice what you hear. Are you hearing sounds of the city? Are you hearing bird song? And then open your eyes and notice what you see. And that's the practice that I do every day. And then I spend some time in that state of present awareness, just again, watching, looking, listening, noticing what's going on around me in the natural world. And that's what I recommend that we do to help bring us back into relationship with nature. And, I'm lucky many times I can do this out in the woods, but sometimes you might do it in the middle of the city. Sometimes the nature you might be looking at might be just what's growing out of the cracks in the pavement. But there's many times when I've led this in the city and noticed what's growing out of the cracks on the edge of the parking lot are actually healing herbs. There's always nature around us.
Thank you very much for your time and for your kindness.
Thank you.
I have to say it was very incredible to have you. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
It was the podcast of Gang of Witches, carte blanche to what the feminism. See you at the next full moon. Until then, take care of yourself. Bye.
I'm calling upon my witches everywhere, my witches everywhere. I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere, my brothers everywhere. The time has come to gather